to monitor your own experience if you're here in the sanctuary with these screens. You can always let me know what you think. The one thing I will say, in my experience so far, which is all of 3 weeks, so I'm an expert, look at the screen across from you. That will turn you in to be a part of the community. It is actually quite destabilizing to sort of turn out and be part of the community. So my one suggestion that I've got so far is use the screen that's on a diagonal from you. I think it will help. This Totally Text Shabbat is also a special Shabbat for the Reform movement across the country. Can you all hear me okay? I know the mask isn't ideal, but you gotta wave yeses and nos and all of those things while we're here. Zoom, can you hear me okay? Yay, look at all that. Good to see you. Alana, are you in Colorado?
Yep.
We got a hello from Colorado. Shabbat shalom. It's good to see you.
It's great to see you.
Jewish tradition teaches us that the selection of leaders for a community is not just a privilege, but a collective responsibility. And so on the week when elections have just occurred across the country and within our Commonwealth, we as a Reform movement today are focusing ourselves as a collective on that responsibility, on our Jewish relationship to the election of leaders. Rabbi Yitzchak taught in the Talmud that a ruler is not to be appointed unless the community is first consulted. Think of that, 2,000 years ago, and Jewish tradition is saying it's not going to work out if you don't check in first. A ruler is not to be appointed unless the community is first consulted. In keeping with the insight of this Jewish teaching, it is the duty of all of us in America who cherish democracy to ensure that all Americans are afforded the opportunity to vote and to have their votes counted. That is what the Reform movement is dedicating itself to this week. This week, as we come away from the elections, we are dedicating ourselves. We are 900 congregations across this country. We exist in red states, believe it or not, and blue states. And we are rededicating ourselves to reminding ourselves that voting itself is a sacred privilege, Jewishly and as Americans. Organizers in Georgia and across the country say that they're doing all they can in the states that have passed restricted voter access. They are calling upon the nation itself to step into this conversation. I know sometimes it feels like in Massachusetts, we live in a state where some people have said to me, well, my vote doesn't even count, and it's not going to affect what's happening there. And these people in Georgia and in Texas and in all across our country are asking us, please, please, as fellow Americans, not to take on that mindset, not to live there. President Biden described the new state laws as a once-in-a-lifetime assault on a right to vote, which has been enshrined in this country. Vice President Harris, who is spearheading the White House's efforts on this issue, which is an assignment that she actually requested, told civil rights activists this week that the nation is at an alarming and a consequential moment. This is a moment for action, Harris said Monday in a speech to the National Action Network. And whether we take an oath of office or we take to the streets, we have an important role to play. Harris, who has been convening regular discussions on the issue, urged civil rights activists to keep fighting, not to give up. The Reformed Jewish movement is joining in that fight, and Shir Tikvah is part of the Reformed Jewish movement. We have long believed that the freedom to vote is fundamental to American democracy. We have strongly supported legislation that protects the rights of all citizens to exercise the right to vote. Now I know most most times that you join me on Shabbat, I say to you, it's time to rest. You've done enough. You've done a lot of good. It's time to take a break. I remind you that rest is valuable and deep, and it is not a luxury, despite what the world around us is telling us, but is a necessity of humanity. And this week too, I think we can still rest together in community, but we can focus that rest. In our time together, I hope to use this evening so that we return ourselves to the lights of vision and hope that settle in our soul and illuminate a path forward, a way to move ahead. This Shabbat, we are going to refocus our ideas on our tradition and our country, the words, the values, the visions, the symbols that are an inspiration. We rest today in a way that lets those visions and values settle deeply within our souls, so that this week ahead, we can participate in a nationwide endeavor to change. And I'll get to that nationwide endeavor later, which is my way of saying you can't leave early. Because you won't know what I'm asking you to do if you do. And so we turn to these words that have been on our sanctuary walls since we entered into this community. We turn to each other. We turn to our community who is joining us digitally, and there is even a baby having a bottle, which is the most prayerful thing I've ever seen. I'm so glad to be joined in this moment. We're getting a lot of ahs and oohs here in the sanctuary. I don't know if you can hear it, but how good it is to be in a community that believes that each of us count and should be counted. Hine matov, how good it is. This is on page 2 in your prayer books. Anybody have a tune they really like for Hine matov? Because, you know, my guitar is out of key, so. You want to do the old-fashioned one? Hine matovu manaim, shevet achim gam yachad. Hine matovu manaim, shevet achim gam yachad. Hine matov, shevet achim gam yachad. Hine matov, shevet achim gam yachad. Hine matov u'manayim, shevet achim gam yachad. Hine matov u'manayim, shevet achim gam yachad. As we prepare to light the candles for Shabbat, bringing the light of rest and vision into our community, I share with you a little bit of my family's history in this country, and I invite you to consider your own. Most of my great-grandparents, and I believe, although my mother will correct me if I'm wrong, and she's here tonight, some of my great-great-grandparents came to this country seeking freedoms that were denied to them where they were born. Born Jewish, most of them in the Pale of the Settlement, which was Poland or Russia, depending on the year. They were not a particularly religious group. There is a good bet that If there is a heaven, they are all sitting in heaven now wondering how they got a rabbi out of this deal. But they came to this country knowing that they were inescapably Jewish, nonetheless. And that birthright had, in the country of their origin, determined a future for them and limited a future for them. So they did the bravest thing I can imagine a person doing. As brave as our forebears Abraham and Sarah, they went forth from the land that they had known to lands unknown in search of blessing. But they went forth with the one thing that people need to send them out of circumstances. They went forth with hope. Most of my ancestors beat the Statue of Liberty to New York, as far as I can tell. We've been here a long time, particularly in the Dean side of the family. But her light has been an important symbol to my family as New Yorkers, as it has been to so many Americans. It is a light of hope that this country would hold up to its highest ideals. On this Shabbat night, we remind ourselves of the vision of who we might yet be. We light candles, as we do every Shabbat, and we pray that our highest aspirations may be yet in our future. Judy and Andrew, it is an honor to invite you to come light our candles for Shabbat. The blessing will be found on page 1 of your prayer books. Mm-hmm. The other option is the high tech. Okay. Mm-hmm. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Please make sure you've wished somebody in the sanctuary a Shabbat Shalom. And on Zoom, using our chat function, you can wish each other a Shabbat Shalom as well. The Kabbalists created Kabbalah Shabbat, a section of Shabbat that is meant to lead us up. It is psalms, which are just songs that are meant to prepare us. We're meant to sing ourselves into excitement and joy for Shabbat to arrive. Now, the word for song in Hebrew is a shir. It's the same as the word for poem. Rather than try to offer you shirim, my songs, I thought we could listen to some poetry to prepare us for Shabbat, and this Shabbat in particular. So I brought you 2 shirim, 2 poems for us to reflect on together.
The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here, at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
And one more shir, one more poem for us to enjoy, which speaks of what we might yet be.
Mr. President, Dr. Biden, Madam Vice President, Mr. Emhoff, Americans, and the world. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always just is. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. We, the successors of a country and a time where a skinny black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother can dream of becoming president, only to find herself reciting for one. And yes, we are far from polished, far from pristine, but that doesn't mean we are striving to form a union that is perfect. We are striving to forge our union with purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. And so we lift our gazes not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first, we must first put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true. That even as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hoped, that even as we tired, we tried, that we'll forever be tied together, victorious, not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. Scripture tells us to envision that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. That is the promised glade, the hill we climb, if only we dare it, because being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy. And this effort very nearly succeeded. But while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. In this truth, in this faith we trust, for while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. This is the era of just redemption. We feared it at its inception. We did not feel prepared to be the heirs of such a terrifying hour, but within it we found the power to author a new chapter, to offer hope and laughter to ourselves. So, while once we asked, how could we possibly prevail over catastrophe? Now we assert, how could catastrophe possibly prevail over us? We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be, a country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free. We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation, because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation. Our blunders become their burdens. But one thing is certain: if we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left. With every breath from my bronze-pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rise from the gold-limbed hills of the west. We will rise from the wind-swept northeast, where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked south. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover in every known nook of our nation, in every corner called our country. Our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.
If we are brave enough, love becomes our legacy. We journey into the blessing of the Shema. It is a journey. It seems like the rabbis just throw prayer after prayer after prayer. They're not. They're telling us a story. And they're telling us a story that is centered on love and ends in hope. And so we turn to page 15 as we prepare ourselves to take this journey with each other and our ancestors. I invite you to rise in body or in spirit. Yitkada v'yitkada shemei rabba Be'alma divrach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei B'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael Badala, badala uv'izman kariv v'yimeru amen Yehei shmei rabba mevorach le'olam u'me'almaya Yitbarach, Yitbarach ve'yishtabach V'yitpar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalach Shemei dekudesha b'richu Le'elam min kol birchata v'shirata Tushbechata v'nechemata Damiram be'alma Amen. We call each other home into our sanctuary of prayer, of time, of space. Baruch Hu, dear one. Baruch Hu, dear one. Shekhinah, holy name. When I call on the light of my I'll call back to you. Let's do it that way. You go ahead. Baruch Shekhinah, holy name, when I call on the light of my soul, I come home. And we continue on page 17, inviting ourselves, perhaps commanded by our tradition, to listen to the unity of all. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Vaed. You may be seated. And from that unity, the rabbis taught that with the awareness of it, deeply embedded in ourselves, it was only from that place, they thought, that we could understand how love and compassion are to guide all of our relationships. So we continue on page 18, but put your finger in page 20. We'll chant ourselves into days and nights of love. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha bechol levavcha uvechol nafshecha uvechol meodecha ve'hayu hadivarim ha'eleh asher anochi mitzavecha hayom alevavecha vishinantam levanecha vidibarta bam beshivtecha b'veitecha uvlechtecha vaderech uveshachbecha uvekumecha ukshartam leot al yadecha vehayu letotafot beineinecha uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha uvisharecha leman tizkeru vasitem et kol mitzvotai vitem kedoshim lelohechem ani Adonai Elohechem asher hotzeti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim lihiot lachem Elohim ani Adonai Elohechem. And the rabbis who wrote this blessing journey for us in a space of exile. These prayers are post-exile prayers, still turned to the idea of freedom and return. They returned to the crossing of the sea and the hope of finding a homeland over and over again. They return there twice a day, morning and night, and we return there weekly in our prayers to remind ourselves that freedom is possible. It is just a journey. We turn to the words Freedom by Langston Hughes. Freedom will not come today, this year, nor ever through compromise and fear. I have as much right as the other fellow has to stand on my own 2 feet and own the land. I tire so of hearing people say, let things take their course. Tomorrow is another day. I do not need my freedom when I'm dead. I cannot live on tomorrow's bread. freedom is a strong seed planted in a great need. I live here too. I want my freedom, just like you. With these words, I'm going to ask you something that it might feel uncomfortable to answer. I always like to start with the easy questions, you know? It's like a Band-Aid. You can tell I'm the kind who just goes right for it, right? Does your Judaism affect your politics? Does it affect how you vote, or if you vote, or when you vote, or who you vote for? That's a hard question. If you're willing to answer it now, you're welcome to, but I'm going to come back to that question for you at the end. And do you think it should? And do you think religion should? And do you think I'm going to trip on all the wires? It's a good question. Anybody want to have an initial comment? Annie?
So, of course, my Judaism affects how I vote in my politics, because my Judaism is the foundation of my values. And my values dictate how I vote. So, as you know, and that's before, I always chant, okay, the lines that I think should be our immigration policy, which is treat the stranger in your land as yourself. Period. End of subject. There's no qualifications. That's it. Jump off the cliff, take the risk. And so I vote for people who support that policy. Do I think my religion should affect my vote in the sense of my voting only for things that I think are good for Jews or for candidates or through that lens? I would hope that I don't, because I think that's biased. But I'm a human being and I can't tell you that I don't. So that's my answer.
That's a really good answer. Anybody else want to either comment on Annie's answer or comment on the question or the experience of being asked the question?
I was going to say the same thing.
Oh.
I was just saying what she was thinking.
You're channeling each other. Absolutely.
I was just going to say that as someone who chose Judaism as my religion, that I chose Judaism because to me, you can't take the action you live in community away from religion. The two are simultaneously true. And Judaism allowed me to take the way I wished to live in community into my religious life. So I think it's both directions.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just a one-directional conversation. It has to go both ways. Beautifully said. Beautifully said. There are initial questions or comments. Anybody scared of religion and politics? I am. I am. And you know, as Annie said, we have to be aware of our own biases, right? And maybe that's the way we think about that, is we're at least aware of it. But certainly I get a little squeamish when it's not my religion in particular that's driving the policy. Yeah, Lynn, and then Erin.
So I think people's value systems impact how they vote. And in some people, their value systems are congruent with their religion. And for other people, they're the opposite of what they profess to be their religion. But I think the religion may be secondary to just what we hold as internal values.
Oh, that's a really interesting point. And Jonathan Haidt talks a lot about how we hold internal values that are actually separate. The stories we tell themselves about them are secondary to the values themselves. We sort of have initial gut reactions to things that tell us that's a right thing or that's a wrong thing. And then as humans, we're really good at telling ourselves stories to explain that gut reaction that we have to it. And there are some people who say that's actually what religion is. Those are literally the stories we start telling ourselves in community to do that, explaining to those initial reactions of right and wrong. And then it becomes a self-feeding loop a little bit. Aaron, yeah.
So I kind of hope that my religion doesn't affect the way I vote, because I think we have some really good values, and I hope they're universal values, so that everybody's voting to a good set of universal values. I'd rather not think that they're just Jewish values.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Other initial comments before we turn to our text? What do you think Judaism teaches you about how you should vote? We heard Annie's, right? It's her immigration policy. It's based on our Bible. Welcome the stranger as yourself. Are there other standout teachings to you from Judaism that have affected you, your relationship to voting or politics in general? Not all of us are lucky enough, by the way, to get to chant our immigration policy yearly, so if you can't come up with it just at the top of your head, I also don't carry Bible verses around and just, sort of usually drop them in. That was a very impressive move. But are there things, I'll tell you, it's not exactly religion, and she would hate to think of it as religion, because my grandmother was a devout socialist. Religiously socialist. I know you're not supposed to say that, but and she used to walk into churches whenever she was traveling the world over, and she would see these gorgeous ornate churches that were supposed to teach you about values of beauty and God and thinking larger and bigger than yourself, and all she would ever do was look at them and say, think of all the people they could have fed with that, right? And I thought of that as her religion. I thought of that as her understanding of what it was as a Jewish socialist to understand what the point of her religion was. Was it pointed you to, well, how many people could you feed? I don't need to think about the grandeur. I need to think about the mundane. That was actually her religion. It was the way she used to dress my mom up on Rosh Hashanah and take her to the park, because she was definitely not going to a synagogue. So, so that was a family lore story that motivated how I go to the polls, right? As I hear my grandma say, she was not a grandma, she was a bubby. In particular, she was Bubgit. Say, this is what you should think about according to your religious value system when you go into these polls. Are there other versions? Yeah.
So one thing from studying Talmud is that they preserve the minority voices. There are tons of arguments. Sometimes they're not nice to each other, but all the disagreements are in there. The people that lose in the arguments and the people that win. And I think that that's important. People who lose and win. So preserving the discussion itself is a value that you think is important as you approach the larger world. That's a value. And respecting the loser too, to keep their voice in there. Respecting, so it's a couple of activities that happen in that, right? It's not just preserving the fact of debate, respect for the loser, and keeping that, and it's known, it's named. It's not just there was a different opinion. It's this is what the other opinion was. Yeah. Other teachings that people think about including in the national conversation, it would be helpful to include in the national conversation. All right, let's turn to our texts and see what we have here. Did I give you all text slides? Oh, I did. Usually I hand you text sheets. Anybody want to be the voice of Leviticus? Annie. Sure. Thanks.
My favorite part of Leviticus.
Yeah, tell us which part it is.
This is the holiness code.
That's exactly right. This is the part of Leviticus that says this is how you live a holy life.
Yeah, this is the easy part of Leviticus.
It's the good part. It's okay, we can say it.
You shall not render an unfair decision. Do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich. Judge your kinsmen fairly.
What do you think? What's it say to you? What's it talking about? How many of you are judges?
Nephew?
I do some judging.
Oh, there you go. You can judge me, right?
A whole list.
You have a whole list. So tell us if you're not a judge, right? Because if you're a judge, this is easy. Right? I get it. Okay. Both plaintiff, whoever shows up, I'm going to treat fairly. But let's assume that the Talmud is aimed towards a community full of judges, or the Leviticus is aimed for a community full of judges. Who cares? Why is this relevant to us? Yeah, Lynn. Yeah, Lynn.
I think if you just step out of being a judge, like somebody in court, but just look at like argument against bias. Like, so just whatever the person in front of you is presenting to you, just hear and see who they are and what they're saying, and forget about like what group they come from, whether it's a rich group or a poor group or some other group.
So this is an argument about how we interact with one another.
Yeah, it could be. On the other hand, I don't necessarily agree with it in any case, because when you're thinking about equity, you may want to take somebody's group identity into account in order to create an equitable outcome.
Oh, interesting. So this can be useful, right? If you're carrying a bias within you that would cause you to hear what somebody says to you in a way that is a negative reflection of your sort of societal understandings of where they come from. But equally, you could miss important parts of who they are that have caused them to be or present or act in the way that sort of brings them into the interaction with you.
Right, we don't want to be colorful.
Yeah. Interesting.
We need to be, know there are biases. I think what you're saying is, like, be aware of your biases, but be aware of the individual in front of you. It's like a balance.
It's an awareness thing, right? It's the idea that when you approach somebody, know that there are multiple narratives happening in that interaction, other than the one that you're actually supposedly sitting there paying attention to. Yeah, Nan.
I was going to say that even if we don't want to be, that we are all judging constantly. At least I am always judging. And one of the things I really like about the last thing about do not judge rather to judge your kids unfairly is I think there's such a strong element in American society in terms of loyalty. And that to me this verse really says, think about all people equally, even those you are loyal to. That you can't, do not place your loyalty above reality. Do not place your loyalty above an old-fashioned word, righteousness.
Yeah. It's thinking about the relationships that can play both for strength and to cause you to over-identify, perhaps, or under-identify with the human being who's sitting in front of you. And it's lifting that up to the conscious level to say, fairly, right? Fairly is such an interesting word. What does fairly mean? It's such a it's inherently going to be our own individual understanding. And yet, that's exactly the point, right? To understand that it's your own understanding that might be coming into play in the interaction. Really interesting, yeah.
I was just going to say, though, there is also the concept of to treat people fairly is not to treat them equally.
Yes.
Because people need different things. And you treat them with an eye to what they need.
I love that, fairly, right? And an understanding of fair is not about, as I say to my kids all the time, it's not the same, right? I don't treat one child exactly the same way I treat the other child. And as you can imagine, with a 6 and a 9-year-old, I get that's not fair, right? But that is the definition that you're putting forth of fair. That's exactly fair, is according to the need, according to what is in front of you is what is fair. Beautifully said. Other pieces that jump out. Now, believe it or not, the conservative movement cites this verse not as about courts, but as about voting. Can anybody imagine what they're doing, how they get from here to voting? Yeah?
Yeah.
It's not easy. It took me a minute to sort of wiggle my way through to why this was about voting. Annie, what you got?
So I'll take a stab at that.
Yeah.
So voting is a communal act.
Mm-hmm.
It's about your community. What you need to do is be judging what is right for the community, what's a fair decision for the community, not what is in your best interest, necessarily, at least as narrowly defined. So, for example, just because you own a really nice big house in Arlington doesn't mean you shouldn't vote to raise your taxes to pay for the house, even if your kids have already graduated. There's a communal responsibility, right? It also means that when you are choosing your leadership in Arlington, you should be considering what policies they are going to put in place to protect homeowners on fixed income and other policies that are going to help the people most affected by rising taxes. So it's this broad decision making that means you have to weigh not just today's sound bites, but this larger picture.
So this is not you, this is y'all.
Yeah.
Right? This is you as a society. So read it as a communal, not you. It's not talking to you, right? It's talking to all of you sitting here, which often is the case with our text. It's probably trying to do two things at the same time, which you probably shouldn't try to do. But what would it mean to render an unfair decision as a society? Right? What does that mean to not show favor to the poor or deference to the rich as a society? What does it mean to judge your kinsmen fairly as a society? Right? And so the RA, which is the Rabbinical Association for the Conservative Movement, actually when they understood this voting rights issue coming down through the not through the courts, and unfortunately a little bit stuck in the Senate as well, but they actually turned to this verse of all the verses that you might imagine, and they say this is the foundation for what it means that every single person should get a vote.
Hey, excuse me.
Yes.
So wait.
Yes.
You're saying the conservative movement, the Jewish conservative movement.
Correct.
When you brought this up initially, you said, this is what conservatives are using.
Oh, sorry.
I assumed you
Oh.
meant. I was thinking Annie was describing this sort of great thing. But you were saying it was those rotten conservatives.
Well, we still do have a non-for-profit status, so I will not say anything like that. I promise, at least not while it's being filmed and shown on the internet. Sorry, Amy. That'll be yours to clean up. But yes, my reference point is very Jewish. And so when I say, now do you hear it differently when I say, this is what the conservative Jewish movement is using as their understanding for why, as a Jewish community, we have a responsibility to ensure that every American has access to easy voting and the ability to have that vote counted. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, we're going to go to, Aaron, we're going to, yep, one more comment on this.
I can also see in this a demand for campaign finance reform.
Yes.
Because it appears to be that the way it works now, voting favors the rich because they can pay for it.
We're coming for that next. Don't you worry, the Reform Movement has a strong, how many of you are familiar with the Religious Action Center of the Reform Movement? A strong advocacy arm of the Reform Movement that is working hard to get voting and campaign finance reform among many of the other values of our Jewish community into the national conversation. So Annie, you maybe stole my text sheet a week early. You did, because this next text from the Talmud talks exactly about what this is. So from Brachot 55a. Rabbi Yochanan said, the Holy One, blessed be, they proclaims three things: famine, plenty, and a good leader. So think about what that sentence means. Let's pause there, because pulling apart the Talmud, we could be here till midnight.
Right.
But essentially, three things says God's in charge of famine. You can think of that of the natural world, right? Whether it's functioning, not functioning, rain's coming, not coming, all of those things that the ancient world would have said, I don't know, I can't explain why it's happening or not. Plenty, the opposite, and a good leader. That one seems out of line with the other two, right? Why? A good leader is in Exodus 31:2. God spoke to Moses saying, see, I called by the name Bitzalel, son of Uri, which is the man who is the great craftsman of the tabernacle. His name is Bitzalel, and he gets sort of picked up out of obscurity. He's got the artistry and the beauty and all the things that you need. Right, so what is the Talmud saying? There are moments when somebody gets lifted up out of obscurity into a position that elevates them into the communal conversation. Rabbi Yitzchak said, we mustn't appoint a leader for the community without consulting it. As in Exodus 35 later, see, God called by name Bitzalel. So what happens is that Bitzalel gets lifted up, appointed, and then everybody has to agree. Everybody has to agree, as if to say it's not enough to have the skill, to have the charisma, to have the whatever it is that enables one person to rise in the midst of a community. It has to be something else as well. And what is the missing ingredient for true leadership in the Jewish community? It is the community agreeing that in fact is the person. And so, if we turn to Pirkei Avot, we know we have to agree. We know we have to be right. In order for a leader to be invited into be a leadership community, boy, that was about 15 sentences all started in the same time. Let's try it again. We know that the community has to agree in order for, in the Jewish tradition, for a leader to have the authority, right? They may have the charisma, they may have the skill, but in order for them to have the authority, they need to be agreed upon by the community. And so where does that leave us? You, me, Massachusetts residents by and large, Alana Press, if you're still here, you're not in Massachusetts anymore, but in Colorado. Where does that leave us and our responsibility if it doesn't seem to be exactly our fight? In Pirkei Avot, Hillel used to say, do not separate yourself from the community, and do not trust in yourself until the day of your death. The second part's an odd phrase, but it sort of means don't leave it until it's too late. And I could go into the whys of why it means it, but let's just take my word for it tonight anyway. Why? Because the community is counting on you to be part of the voice of who gives the authority for the leadership. And if you think it's not your problem, because it's not, as Annie said at the beginning, an issue that directly affects your community, that doesn't make you any less responsible for picking the leader, according to Jewish tradition. It doesn't make you any less responsible to get involved in the issue if the issue doesn't affect you. And so that's why I can feel like with pretty good standing, say to you, on behalf of the Reform movement, and I don't get to speak on behalf of the Reform movement that often, and actually usually I'm too liberal for the Reform movement, so don't tell them about me, but But I'm too liberal for the reform movement. I'm going to get myself kicked off the left end of it. It's fine. I'm okay with it. It's why the reform movement is asking all of its members, 900 congregations, biggest denomination in American Judaism, to participate in our call-in days this week to our congressmen, to say we care about voting rights. We know you lost a lot this week. We know you're wondering what the future looks like. We know that you're regrouping after an election. We know all of these politics are happening in the world, but we want you to keep this bill in mind. Because this bill says that every vote counts. This bill says, the Freedom to Vote Act says that there should be national standards for what it means to run a free and fair election. Think about that verse, don't separate yourselves from the community. That means the whole community gets a vote in what a fair election means. It doesn't mean your local town gets to decide what a fair election means, because it's going to affect all of us. And so we're going to call. It's an old-fashioned thing to do. And you might think to yourself, well, we're from Massachusetts. But I promise, if the boards light up between 12 and 1, which is what we're asking you to do this week, take a day. There's an online website. We're going to put it in the chat function for our Zoom participants, and you can find it on our website, and we sent you an email. We're asking you to write a letter and to call. The letter takes 15 seconds. The reform movement has already done it for you. All you have to do is sign. And if you put in your zip code, they'll even tell you who you're sending it to. They'll direct the email for you. It's amazing what technology can do. But lend your actual voice. The letter's easy. The email's easy. Pick up the phone and say, I'm part of the community that cares. Not just if my voice is heard, but if the voice of those who currently aren't being heard is heard. Because that's what it means to be not separating yourself from this community this week. It'll take you 5 minutes at most. Lend your voice, if you can, to this campaign. If you enjoyed studying text with me, and I hope you did, please join me tomorrow. We're going to go to the Torah text for the week, Parshat Toldot. We're going to move to the study of our traditional texts together, and we'll engage in very much the way we did tonight, searching for meaning and purpose and understanding that affects not just our intellect, but as Nan said, the way we act, the way we live, because that's what it means to be Jewish. It's not about whether you believe, it's about how you live. We turn to words of healing for our community, moving into the concluding prayers this evening. If there is somebody you are praying for in search of healing, and you'd like to add their name into our community on the chat, using the technology you are using to join us or here in our sanctuary. If there's somebody you are praying for, I invite you to raise your hand. It'd be an honor to call on you so you can say their name out loud.
Barbara Lentz. Ron Walsh.
Our community prays for Joyce, for Robin Einzig, Stanley Roth, Brenda Meyerson, Patty Richard, Diana Sanders, Andy Cassell, Harry Menko, Jessica Goyerton, Dennis Pappas, Joyce and David Adamson, the Primerman family, David Hale,
Tom Alexander, Joyce Catania, Susan Zimmerman Innes, Arlene Norris, Paul Coulard, Jeff Wisnia, Jonathan Sharon, Deb Midman, Neil Daniels Midman, Susan Trendall, Melissa Martin and her daughter, Pat Lazar, Harriet Levy, Ann Pillow, Judy Donaldson, Colleen Berry, Michael Slonim, Alan and Joanne Travis, Fiona Sutton, Ayana Masla, Norman and Fran Waxler, Sue Boardman, Angela Panzone, Linda and Fred Lukasik, Nancy Alpert, Ed Snow, Debbie Gilman, Patty Shepard, Jennifer Chase, Ellen Lee, Jeff Bray, Vicki Oman, Barbara Culanine, Elizabeth Wall, Anya Cabo, Bud and Jenny Baluta, Marianne and Jeff Nagel, Annie Graham and her daughter Sandy, Rich and Joan Richmond, Ken Blumberg, Ayelet Bat-Chava V'her Shmuel, Claude Lieber, Nancy Lazaro Lieber, and Kathy Nath. Together we'll sing When the World is Sick, joining ourselves to our community. When the world is sick, can't no one be well? And I dreamt we were all beautiful and strong. When the world is sick, can't no one be well? And I dreamt we were all beautiful and strong. Ana elna rifana la, ana elna rifana la, ana elna rifana la, ana elna rifana la. And we move into our prayer, Mourner's Kaddish, feeling those whose presence came before, whose love lives on, whose legacy is part of our life. We are in the period of Shloshim for Fran Mills. We honor the yahrzeit of David Mintz, of Phyllis Blackman, and Richard Yusufian. And we are in the year of remembrance for Jack Langerman, Gladys Schuker, and Roberta Lipperman. If there is someone you are remembering whose name you would like to bring into our community, I invite you to use the chat function of the technology you're using to join us, or raise your hand in the sanctuary so you can say that person's name out loud.
And Cutler.
We become one community of memory with the words of Mourner's Kaddish, page 44. I invite you to rise in body or spirit. Yitgadol v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah, be'alma divra chirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon u'vyomechon, uv'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael, ba'gala u'vizman kari v'imru amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam u'almei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh V'yita dar, v'yita le, v'yita lal, shemei dekudasha brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tushbechata v'nechemata. Damiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shamaya. V'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav. Hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. May the one who makes peace in the heavens make peace for us, for all Israel, and all who dwell on earth, to which we say, Amen. You may be seated. Just a few announcements. I have copies of the poem, The Hill We Climb, by Amanda Gorman, that incredible poet, but of course, because it's totally Text Shabbat, I have them with all the textual references that she is using along the ways. I don't know if we caught them all, but there's certainly a lot of them. So if more text is what you need to create your Shabbos experience, I know you're all just dying for it. It's my nerdy little rabbi heart, right? It hopes. Then you are welcome to take one of these, and it is pretty extraordinary, the weaving of references that she does, how many will connect not only to the larger American narrative, but to the Hebrew Bible as well, and some that I certainly did not catch in the original reading thereof. Like I said, we have Torah on Tap returning for its fall season, coming tomorrow here in this sanctuary. There is a Zoom link available. This is low-tech Zoom. So we have our extraordinary tech team, Dan and Don in the back, running all of this technology, making it seamless. Tomorrow you get me with a computer. Less seamless. But we understand that not everybody can come or feel safe yet coming back into our sanctuary, and we do want to make it available. So tomorrow, 4 o'clock, settle yourself somewhere comfortable and become part of our community of learning text together. With that, I would like to wish you a very Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. You want one of these? Yeah, you bet. You know what? You're not allowed to lick your fingers when you're separating sheets.